Hey there, what's going on? It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson here. Welcome to the Flex Diet Podcast. And today is a little bit different, just me yammering away on a new cool topic. If you're on the newsletter list, you've seen this, and it's probably not new to you at this point since I've been talking about it for about the past 3 to 4 weeks. But it's the topic of physiologic flexibility. And if you are not on the email list, the insider, you can go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. There'll be a spot there to get on the wait list. And once you enter your info there, you'll be on the wait list and on the daily newsletter list where I send out all sorts of great content on how to add performance, add some muscle, better body composition, all without destroying your health in a very flexible format. So get onto the newsletter list. It's free. Right now, that's where probably like 80-90% of my content goes out to. Hop on there. But we're talking today on physiologic flexibility. And in the interest of full disclosure, I have decided to do a course on this. So depending upon when you are listening to this, if you listen to this on the day it comes out, which is most likely going to be a Monday, the 16th of November, you'll have a very limited time if you can find a link by getting onto the newsletter to get the course at an introductory price. If not, I will be offering it again in 2021, so you'll be able to get first crack at it then. But the physiologic flexibility is something I've spent, probably almost like a decade or so thinking about. So if you go backwards in time, 13-ish years ago now, I started working on the concept of metabolic flexibility. And again, this isn't my concept at all. The original pioneer who coined the term is Dr. David Kelly, and around the early 2000s. So you can look up his stuff, which is really, really great. Some seminal work on that. How I fell into it was doing my PhD in exercise physiology and metabolism at the University of Minnesota. And my advisor said, hey, we've got 2 brand new projects, and they both involve a lot of math. And I had transferred from the PhD program in biomedical engineering there, which I had finished almost all the classwork for, except for 2 classes. I had been doing that at that point for almost 3 years and decided to change to exercise physiology since that was really my true passion. So the first meeting that I have after I left the biomedical engineering department because I didn't want to do any more math, I show up to the exercise physiology department and my advisor says, hey, we've got 2 new projects. They both involve a lot of math. And he's looking around the table, and he kind of points at me, and he goes, hey, math boy, these are your projects now. And they were on metabolic flexibility and heart rate variability. And how both of these projects are kind of tied together is we were using the concept of fine-scale variability analysis. So your heart rate will move just a little bit, even at rest, up a little bit, down a little bit, up a little bit, down a little bit. And it turns out that fine scale variability, that small little change while you're in a static and non-exercising position, just seated first thing in the morning, gives us some important information about your physiology. Tells us the status of our autonomic nervous system, how much are you parasympathetic, rest and digest, how much are you sympathetic, more on the stress side. So we tried to, and we did publish research on this, so we did do it, looking at fine scale variability changes with a metabolic cart related to metabolism. What we did is we had people come into the lab and we baseline them. We did body comp, did a bunch of other tests, and by baselining them, we did a VO2 max, so max aerobic test. So what is the highest level you can create energy by using oxygen? So volume of oxygen max, VO2 max. And then we had them repeat these different tests on a bike. We did 30% of VT and 60% of VT. So VT is what's called a ventilatory threshold. It's kind of a transition from sort of aerobic to anaerobic, although that's not really correct. Just think about exercise, and if you stay under that kind of ventilatory threshold, you can go for a relatively long period of time. But once you kind of cross over that threshold, it becomes really hard, and your time to exhaustion or when you have to stop is going to be dramatically less. Again, so if you look at this on a curve, we're not necessarily looking at a linear straight response. We're looking at a curvilinear or kind of an exponential response. So we're looking for that little inflection point on the curve, which is a whole bunch of fancy math and stuff. So when we did this, we then looked at what's called the RER, Respiratory Exchange Ratio. So on a metabolic cart, where you're breathing in and out these little tubes that you have, goes into this fancy machine, it's looking at oxygen and carbon dioxide. And by looking at that ratio, we can determine what fuel, carbs, or fat you're primarily using during that exercise. So this gives us some non-invasive ways to determine fuel usage during exercise, which is awesome. And what we were doing is we had people do steady state exercise, meaning the intensity is not changing. It's not going up, not going down. And we did that at 30% of their ventilatory and then 60% of their ventilatory threshold. By doing that, we're then comparing people to themselves. Because we just did recreational athletes, and you're going to have some athletes that are a little bit more aerobically fit than other athletes. So this then makes it more of a fair comparison across this kind of wide variety of people. We're doing a percentage of their max. Just like if you went into the gym and you know what your 1 rep max is on a bench press, and I said, okay, I want you to do reps at 70% of that 1 rep max. That makes it similar across a group of people, even though their max bench press may be 135 to 275. Again, it's not absolutely perfect, but probably one of the better ways of doing it. So if we go back to what we're looking at, the fine scale variability, we wanted to see, does the RER, this ratio that's telling us how much fat and how much carbohydrates are being used during exercise, does a fine scale analysis, or what's called a variability analysis, some fancy math, does that give us any more additional information? Just like doing a variability analysis on resting heart rate, we have heart rate variability. That analysis gives us the status of your autonomic nervous system. So we get more and additional information beyond what is just your average heart rate. What we found was that this procedure was reproducible, meaning that we did what's called a gauge R study. People come into the lab, and we wanted to see if they came back again and again under same conditions. This new testing procedure we did, is it reproducible? If under the same conditions on 3 different times, we get 3 completely different results, then this new testing procedure, it's not reproducible at all. So we have no hope of trying to figure out any other additional information from it. So we did publish that. It's in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. It is reproducible, which is good. The downside is we didn't really have any more time left, and I actually wanted to graduate, so I did a couple other studies that were kind of related to this to graduate. So we don't know, does that really predict metabolic flexibility? And even fast forward, 7 years now after that's been published, we still don't know. So if anyone's interested in continuing that research, please drop me a note. So all of this going back to metabolic flexibility, that's what I started studying in the lab 13 years ago. And a few years after I started that, I started thinking about, how does this apply to the physiology of the entire organism, like you as an individual? And at the time, variability analysis was still pretty new. And even now, although heart rate variability is more popular, I would say not a lot of people really understand the math of it at a base level. And the nice part is, as an end user, you probably don't need to get that granular. However, as a researcher, it is definitely going to be in your favor, especially considering some of the I'll say, interesting peer reviews I've seen in that area. So fine scale variability analysis, does it tell us more information about a system? So then we get into what are the kind of the dynamics of that particular system. Again, this is the concept of lateral transfer. Can we take an idea from one area, heart rate variability, apply it to another area, variability of this fuel usage marker, RER, and maybe we find some cool stuff from that. So can we now transfer the same idea from metabolic flexibility up to physiology flexibility or system flexibility? And my bias is I think that we can. Of course, that's my bias. So what does this look like in English? And before we get to that point, if we look at other literature from different areas, we do now see that there is things related to mental flexibility. We do see things now with fine scale variability analysis being applied to gait, so walking patterns, sway, bar path analysis, and most of the time whenever we've looked at it, having more fine scale variability in the system is a marker of health and sometimes performance. Performance being maybe. So we know that by doing this, in general, from systems we've looked at, we get a little bit more information. So our transfer of the idea of heart rate variability to RER variability looks like it's going to be pretty good. Again, we need another study to prove if that's actually true or not, or at least provide some data in that area. So what I did is I started thinking about the transfer of the idea of metabolic flexibility to system flexibility. And that the more flexible your system is, the more we can tolerate these variations across different systems. That should be a marker for being more healthy, more robust, or more anti-fragile. So when we apply a little bit of stress to the system actually recovers and gets better because of that little amount of stress that's been applied. So then the next question becomes, okay, so outside of the basic stuff, which I cover in the Flex Diet podcast, some basic exercise, just parameters, is primarily focused on nutrition and a little bit on sleep. Outside of people who are covering those basics, which we know work, and there's a ton of data to show that, what is the next level that we should be focused on? How would we be able to figure that out? And I started looking at, okay, so what systems in the body have to absolutely be regulated, or else you're going to be in a world of hurt? Because my bias is your system only really cares about survival. If you want better performance, you need to teach it to survive better. Its number one job is to figure out how to survive from one day to the next. And then I came across some research on things called homeostatic regulators. So an example would be temperature. Your body temperature has to be held pretty close at 98.6. If your core temperature, and yes, if we want to measure this in the lab, you get the little thermometer up the keister, that's how you would measure it. But if your core temperature changes by more than just a few degrees, you are going to be in a world of hurt, either too high or too low. However, we know that you can go into colder environments and be okay for a period of time. You can go into hotter and warmer environments for a period of time and be okay. And things like exercise produces a lot more heat. Right? Again, not news to anyone who's exercised when it's been a little bit cold out. The next thing you know, you're sweating because you're too warm. We could combine exercise into warmer or hotter environments. We can change other environmental factors such as humidity. Currently recording this from South Padre, Texas, where it's incredibly humid. So this morning, even just doing a run on the beach, which is awesome, the temperature was only 75, but humidity was around 88%. So I was sweating like crazy by the end because humidity is going to affect how well the water vapor, sweat turns into water vapor, right? So the cooling effects of your body. Everybody knows it feels much worse when the humidity is high compared to low. So we know the body has these adaptive mechanisms to either try to produce more heat or try to dissipate more heat because the body absolutely has to regulate 98.6. So core temperature is a homeostatic regulator of your physiology. Another one would be pH, right? The pH of your blood has to stay very, very similar, or else you are going to be in a world of hurt. Now, we see this in hospital care in the case of sepsis, basically kind of a blood infection in air quotes. Other issues in the hospital where your body can't regulate pH very well, kidney disease, different things, and you end up in a world of hurt. However, healthy individuals can regulate pH quite well. You can drink something within reason that's somewhat acidic and somewhat basic and still be okay. Your body has these mechanisms to regulate it. If you get on the rower and do a wonderful 2K and go balls out as hard as you can, odds are you're going to produce what's called, quote, lactic acid. So lactic acid immediately disassociates into lactate and hydrogen ions. So lactate really gets used as a fuel, can be pulled out by working muscles, cardiac tissue, the brain. Lactate is actually a very high energy fuel that's used by the body. It's not a negative in any way. Also has different signaling effects across the body. It's the hydrogen ions that cause issues with fatigue. They can directly change the local pH, which does have a little bit of a positive effect acutely. But long term, if it gets too high, it can impair actin and myosin contraction, right? So muscle contraction in and of itself, which is why if you've ever done a bunch of leg extensions, it starts to burn, and at some point you just can't do any more. Part of that fatigue, or a good portion of it, is from the accumulation of hydrogen ions. You're literally dumping an acid into the muscle acutely. Your body has to deal with that. You can imagine like doing a 2K, like bigger exercise, exercising more muscle mass. You can build up very high levels of lactate. So when you measure this with like a handheld meter or in the lab, they're measuring lactate, but what they're really doing is lactate is a proxy for hydrogen ions. Again, it's the hydrogen ions that are what's causing the fatigue and literally causing the burning sensation. Again, your body can regulate this, and we don't see massive changes in blood pH chronically. Again, you may see a little change acutely. So we have these systems in place where your body is really, really good at handling changes in acute level pH. So pH is a homeostatic regulator in the body. Another one would be blood glucose. You only have in a healthy individual about a teaspoon, so about 5 grams of blood glucose at any one point in time. Now again, that's an average, and it will flux up and down depending upon meals. It can definitely be different even in type 2 diabetics. But even people who are unregulated diabetes, you're still not talking about a massive amount of blood glucose, even though it definitely starts to cause issues. So blood glucose has to be regulated very tightly, and it is in healthy individuals. However, we can then kind of challenge that system. You can take in high amounts of carbohydrates, like I call the 2 Pop-Tart test, to about 80 grams of a highly processed carbohydrate. And ideally, in U.S. Numbers, blood glucose shouldn't get much above 120, 130, maybe 140. Exact number is debatable, right? But your body is good at handling this high amount of incoming carbohydrates and glucose and can handle it. On the other end, if you do some type of fasting or even a ketogenic type diet, your body can handle these lower amounts of blood glucose. So again, blood glucose is regulated at very, very tight levels. Or in physiology terms, we'll say it's kind of semi-clamped, meaning that it's held at a pretty much a constant. Last one, again, this is not necessarily meant to be an exhaustive list per se, is oxygen and CO2. Now again, we can do things acutely to do like maybe a Wim Hof breathing technique where we're doing a lot of hyperventilation and then a breath hold to try to change that acutely. So when we are hyperventilating, we're actually blowing off more CO2. So CO2 is a byproduct, not necessarily a waste product. And when we do that, that is acutely changing CO2 levels. The main thing that's triggering our brains to breathe is CO2, not oxygen. Oxygen is kind of the backup system to CO2, which is why if you've ever done like some Wim Hof techniques or some supraventilation methods, you inhale and exhale very rapidly. Again, only do this on dry land. Probably laying down is going to be a great idea because you can pass out. If you do that, you will find that you can hold your breath a lot longer. Why? You just got rid of a lot more CO2. So you have less of that thing that's triggering your brain to breathe. So oxygen and CO2 have to be regulated very, very tightly. If you've ever put one of those pulse ox on your finger, you'll notice that it is held pretty constant even during a lot of exercise. But again, we can kind of challenge that system. We can do things like exercise that speed up how much oxygen is being used, right? Aerobic metabolism that is using oxygen. We can do other things to challenge it also. So a breath hold or a hypo method is holding your breath. So no exchange of oxygen, no exchange of CO2. And because metabolism is still running, right, we have our baseline resting metabolic rate, we are still producing CO2. So since no air is being exchanged, CO2 is not being off-gassed, CO2 levels will then start to build up. Again, so we can play with O2 and CO2. You can even look in research settings where they've done some super interesting studies of hypo and hyperoxia. So some of the early studies, they had this massive like steel, it looks like a large kind of just basically a bank vault, and you could seal it, right? So they're trying to make a hyperoxic chamber. And they put a bike in there and they had people exercise under high pressure of oxygen. So now we're changing that partial pressure of oxygen, and they're looking at different exercise physiology effects. If you look at studies on elevation, again, elevation is changing the partial pressure of oxygen. So this gives us some information about how the system is regulated. So O2 and CO2, again, are homeostatic regulators. Your body has to operate within a very fine range of those. However, acutely, we can handle some kind of insults or stressors to that system. And the system will get a little bit better for it and be more trained in that area. Now, again, like all of these things, can you go too far and potentially be harmful? Absolutely. So you need to know what you're doing. You need to make sure that you are doing it in the best way possible and that you're staying absolutely safe the whole time. So my point is, going back to physiologic flexibility, my bias is that these four systems are the main systems we should be targeting. If we target these homeostatic regulators, then we can make them a little bit more adaptable. They can be trained just like your bicep can be trained, just like your aerobic system can be trained. We can be trained to handle more stressors. And when you can handle more stressors at kind of your baseline trained status, that is going to make you a more anti-fragile, robust human being. What that means is that your immune system will probably be better. You'll be able to handle more stress. Your training, you'll be able to recover from that faster, and you'll just be better overall. So again, that's my outline. That's my framework of bias for physiologic flexibility, which in all honesty is a little bit of a made-up term to talk about how all these systems play together. The main systems are based on homeostatic regulators, them being body temperature, pH, blood glucose, and O2 and CO2. And the nice part about this is I think they have a high amount of leverage, meaning that some of the interventions for each one do take some more time. So if you're doing nasal breathing, like building up aerobic base, as my buddy Luke Lehman would say, some kind of least mode training, yes, that will take a fair amount of time for a concentrated period. However, some of the other ones, such as hot and cold exposure, most people haven't trained that system much at all, so it really doesn't take much to do it. I get a little crazy, so I've done like a freezer filled with water. I started at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and literally got in there up to my neck only for 30 seconds. And I would do that daily. And of course, over time, I've gone up to 6 minutes, and then I've gone down to as cold as 42 degrees for 3 minutes. But again, we're talking about minutes per day. You don't need to get that crazy and convert an old freezer. You can do a cold water shower for 10 seconds even. Now again, some of these benefits may be more on the psychological side than the physiology side, but either way, you're training your system in those 4 areas, and it doesn't necessarily take a ton of time. Last part is you can then start to combine them with other things. So for example, my exercise here has been outside in the heat. I have gone to the gym a couple times just for equipment, but I also brought some kettlebells. So yesterday I did my training outside in the sun, in the heat, using kettlebells. Part of the reason for that was more of a logistics because the gym wasn't open. And the other part was I wanted to train in a hotter environment on purpose. I wanted to train my system to dissipate a little bit more heat, also doing exercise in high humidity. Now, I will admit that that doesn't feel very good overall, but I think over time I'm going to be better by having a little bit more extremes in the regulation of temperature. So, any questions on this, feel free to hit me up. Again, I've got a whole certification on it. It's Physiologic Flexibility Certification, where I break down the 4 interventions, the 8 things that plays out to be, right? So temperature will then break down into high temperature and cold temperature. pH will then break down into high pH, low pH, etc. And then within each one of those 8, I have 5 specific action items you can do for yourself and for your clients, and explain the whole system of how to figure out what is best for that. Again, if you're listening to this on Monday, November 16th, you may still be able to sneak on and grab it at a reduced price. Get on the newsletter, go to flexdiet.com, get on the wait list, and you'll get the newsletter there. If you're listening to this after that, look for it coming up in sometime around 2021, first quarter. Again, the Flex Diet Cert will be open again in early January. The thought process is to have the Physiologic Flexibility then open maybe sometime around February or March. I don't have an exact date for it yet. So thank you very much. Greatly appreciate it. I always appreciate all the reviews and everything. So please leave me one and take care.